Hello dear students, this is Mr. Sanjay Kubar. Chawra English Medium School once again welcomes you all for learning 6th standard English subject. Dear students, now we are going to learn lesson number 4.3, Mr. Nobody. Dear students, this is an anonymous poem. It means the author or the poet of this poem is unknown. Let's begin the poem with its introduction. Dear students, the present poem, Mr. Nobody, is a very interesting and humorous poem. Sometimes we make mistakes, we may misbehave, we may trouble others. Sometimes something goes wrong. We may break things, we may throw our things or the others' thing here and there. We do all such things unknowingly, knowingly, accidentally. But generally, whenever we do such mistakes, what do we say? We say sorry for that. And we promise each other to be very careful next time. But some students do not accept their faults. This is because they may get escape from scolding by others. Here we can take the example in our house. If something happens, if something goes wrong, we may break the things, we may scatter the things which belongs to us or others here and there in the room. Then at such time, we do not accept what we do very easily. We blame that to the other persons. Here in the house, if you do such things, then our parents asked us, who did it? Then what's our reply? Our reply is always ready. No, I don't know. Who has done it? I have not done it. Somebody else may have done it. Like this, our answers are always ready. Dear students, the same thing happens in the school also. In the school or in the class, students do some naughty things. They may trouble the teacher or the student. At that time, when the teacher asked, who did it? Then your answer is always ready. I don't know. I have not done it. Somebody else may have done it. Like this, your answers always are ready. So dear students, if you do such mistakes, then you are not generally accepting it. We try to pass it to the other person. Here, we are telling these things are done by somebody else. Actually, who is this somebody? Somebody is nothing but Mr. Nobody. Here, we easily blame to Mr. Nobody. We easily points towards Mr. Nobody because that person is unknown. He is not seen by anybody else. That's why we easily point towards Mr. Nobody. This is what exactly the poet wants to tell here in this present poem, Mr. Nobody. Dear students, in this present poem, Mr. Nobody, the poet talks about a mysterious little person who creates a lot of mischief in the house and gets away with it. Now, let's study this poem. First, we will read out the whole poem. First stanza. I know a funny little man, as quiet as a mouse, who does the mischief that is done in everybody's house. There's no one ever sees his face, and yet we all agree that every plate we break was cracked by Mr. Nobody. Now second stanza. It is he who always tears out books, who leaves the door ajar. He pulls the buttons from our shirts and scatters pins afar. That squeaking door will always squeak. For Preeti, don't you see, we leave the oiling to be done by Mr. Nobody. Now the third stanza. The finger marks upon the door by none of us are made. We never leave the blinds unclosed to let the curtains fade. The link we never spill. The boots that lying around you see are not our boots. They all belong to Mr. Nobody. Now dear students, let's see the first stanza of the poem. I know a funny little man, as quiet as a mouse, who does the mischief that is done in everybody's house. There's no one ever sees his face, and yet we all agree that every plate we break was cracked by Mr. Nobody. Here, in this first stanza of the poem, the poet tells us that he knows a funny little man, and this funny little man is as quiet as a mouse. Here, the poet compares the funny little man with a mouse. Then, what the poet tells us? Here, he tells us that this funny little man does the mischief which is done in everybody's house. Next, the poet tells that there's no one ever sees his face, and yet we all agree that every plate we break was cracked by Mr. Nobody. Here, the poet tells us that this funny little man is not seen by anybody else. Yet, we all are agree on the same point that the plate which has a crack is broken by Mr. Nobody. Here, through this stanza, the poet wants to tell us that whatever we do, whatever we make mistakes, that we easily blame towards Mr. Nobody. Now dear students, let us move on to the second stanza of the poem. Let's see it. It is he who always tears out books, who leaves the door ajar. He pulls the buttons from our shirts and scatters pins afar. That squeaking door will always squeak. For Preeti, don't you see? We leave the oiling to be done by Mr. Nobody. Dear students, here in this second stanza of the poem, the poet tells us the different things done by Mr. Nobody. Here in this stanza, the poet tells us the different mischiefs which are done by Mr. Nobody. First, the poet tells us that Mr. Nobody tears out books. The books which belongs to him, he tears out them. Next, he leaves the door ajar. Ajar means slightly open. He always leaves the door slightly open. Next, Mr. Nobody also pulls out the buttons from the shirts. Then, he also scatters the pins here and there. Actually, the pins are very dangerous. They are very harmful for us. We should not scatter or throw here and there. But Mr. Nobody here scatters the pins here and there, far away. Next, the poet tells that squeaking door. Squeaking means creaking sound of the door. Especially the doors which are old. You know, they make high pitched sound. That's a creaking sound. These old doors always squeak, means they will make always the loud sound, because the poet tells for Preeti. Preeti means here please. The poet tells us that for please. Don't you see that these squeaking doors are left without oiling them by Mr. Nobody. Here in this stanza, the poet tells us the number of things which are done by Mr. Nobody. Actually, this all the work belongs to particular person, but that particular person points very easily towards Mr. Nobody. Mr. Nobody is the person who is responsible for doing all this work. Now dear students, let us try to understand the last stanza of the poem. The finger marks upon the door by none of us are made. We never leave the blinds unclosed to let the curtains fade. The ink we never spill. The boots that line round you see are not our boots. They all belong to Mr. Nobody. Dear students, once again here in this last stanza, the poet tells us the different things which are done by the character Mr. Nobody. Here the poet mentions the other naughty things which are done by Mr. Nobody. First, the poet tells us that Mr. Nobody leaves the finger marks on the door. And next, he tells us that the blinds were also unclosed by Mr. Nobody. Here, blinds means window shades. Here, Mr. Nobody leaves the window shades open for making the curtains dirty. Next, the poet tells us that Mr. Nobody spills the ink, and the boots which are lying here and there in the house, the boots which are seen round us, they are also not thrown by anybody else. Then who is responsible for throwing that books? Of course, Mr. Nobody. The boots which are lying there, they also belong to Mr. Nobody. Here, in this way, the poet tells us that Mr. Nobody is responsible for doing all the mischiefs in the house or in the school or at any other place. He is the person who is responsible for the mess of things in the house. Mr. Nobody uses all the things, but he never put them in proper order. He dirties the home. In this way, the poet, through this poem, Mr. Nobody wants to tell us that if anything goes wrong, everyone points towards Mr. Nobody. He is the person who is responsible for doing all the mischief, all the naughty things. Now dear students, let us try to understand the message that we get from this poem. Dear students, the message which we get from this poem is that we must admit our faults, our mistakes and carelessness. We must not be careless while doing anything or using anything. We should understand our duties and responsibilities. We should respect each other and cultivate the good habits. Now, look at the title of the poem. It is appropriate because the purpose is to blame Mr. Nobody. He is given the name because no one knows who Mr. Nobody is. And the poet expresses the thoughts about Mr. Nobody very easily and simple language. Here, every stanza ends with the word Mr. Nobody. Now dear students, let us find out the rhyming words used in this poem. First, mouse, house, ajar, afar, maid, fade,